I guess my microphone is live. You should always start out with a song, that's what I think. I'm going to guess that maybe half the room, maybe a third, knows what album this came from. Don't shout it out if you know, but show of hands. Anybody know what album this came from? That's what I thought. I am an old guy. I grew up with these guys. Okay, we're going to do a little trivia. I'm going to give you some hints as we go along through the talk, and you can tell me, just shout it out later on in the talk. My name is Rob Conery. I work at Microsoft. I work on the cloud advocacy team. Cloud advocacy team? Anyway, whatever that is. I know you're not supposed to start your talks with an apology or anything like that. Unfortunately, today, I kind of have to lead off with, if you were at the Code Spaces talk and saw Philippe give the talk about dev containers, it's pretty much going to be a repeat. So if there's another talk you want to go to, by all means, and I won't be offended, maybe a little offended, but not totally offended. Second thing I want to say is that this talk is very Wi-Fi heavy, and I do not trust conference Wi-Fi. So what I had to do instead is I had to record everything that I'm going to do, but hopefully that'll be a good thing because I get to show you a lot more stuff. So with that said, let's move on. I'm going to be talking about remote containers, a very descriptive name for something that doesn't make much sense. At Microsoft, that's what we like to do. It is a VS Code extension, and I highly recommend if you don't have it installed and you want to play along, you can actually play along with this talk. You can go to your extensions, find remote containers. It's in preview right now, and then install it and have a good time. You also need Docker to have all this work. Burke Holland, one of the PMs that I work with, and that also works with dev containers, showed me this, and I saw it and I thought, that's neat. VS Code is running Docker for me. I'm excited about this because why? And he said, you just have to play with it a little bit, and then you'll see why it's a good idea. And he's like, here, read the docs. And this is something that you learn when you start reading Microsoft documentation, is that Microsoft's not good at writing documentation. And I couldn't understand what's going on. And oddly, it's my job to help them update the documentation, do some good tutorials. It's also my job to break things, come up with some demos, and tell the team what is good and what is bad. So that's what you're going to see today. So remote containers, the idea is that VS Code is orchestrating a developer experience for you using Docker. And that sentence alone is kind of strange, and it kind of hits people sideways. And the only thing I can say to you is you really have to see it to understand. It's a big problem trying to set up a development environment on a brand new machine. Like I have this nice brand new M1 Mac that I love, and I had to sit down one day. I had to install different versions of Ruby because I use Ruby. I had to install RVM, the version manager. I also install RBNV because I'm a weirdo that way. I had to figure out Python. Which versions of Python do I have? Homebrew, Xcode, all of these things. It is a pain in the butt. And you know, it's okay, because as developers, we make a lot of money. It's totally worth it. But setting up a dev environment can be difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my blog. And oh good, the video is working. I'm so excited. It's working. Woohoo! Dylan was having trouble doing video in the last talk, and I was like, okay, well, let's just see what happens. This is my blog, and it's running Jekyll. It's the first static site generator. It was created back in about 2004. I think there's probably some people in this room who were born that year, which is awesome. Anyway, it's Jekyll, and it's really easy to use. A static site generator, it's Markdown, and if you've ever used static site generators, it's kind of just same old. But it needs Ruby to run, and that is the problem that I always face. So if I want to sit down and write a blog post, I go in and I just hope and pray that everything is going to work. Unfortunately, a lot of times it doesn't, which is what you see here. And this is an error that I encounter constantly. And the reason why, of course, you're going to look at this and say, well, if you don't have any gems installed, little packages for Ruby, if you don't have any gems installed, how are you going to run your system? Well, the funny thing is I did have my gems installed just 2 weeks ago. And it's the same machine. I set everything up and it was working just fine. And I came in the other day and I decided to record it because I wanted to make it part of this talk. They're all gone. Where'd they go? Well, Ruby installs its gems in a global cache. It doesn't have to be that way. You can set it up to install locally if you want to. But by default, it installs it in the global cache. And if you change Ruby versions using RBNV or RVM, which I did, everything goes away. So it's a long story. It's no big deal. All I have to do is just install the dang gems, right? And so that's what I'm doing here. And this is another reason I don't want to use conference Wi-Fi. It takes forever, and stuff comes down. And you guys are sitting there, and you want to see more stuff, right? So I just have to wait a minute, as you can see. And the gems come down, and I get another error. This is so annoying. Like, when you look at this stuff, because I got actually 2 errors here. The first one I got near the top there, I said, did you mean spell checkers merge? What are you talking about? I don't know what that means. It's not quite an error, it's more of a warning. The second error I got is that WebRick, which is the Ruby web server, is no longer bundled with Ruby. And great. So now I have to figure that out, which means I have to use a different version of Ruby. All in all, what I'm trying to say is my inspiration for writing a blog post is now killed, effectively. If you've ever worked with Ruby before or Rails and you try to install it, you might get an error like this. This is because when you try to use native packages, you run into this with Node, you run into this with just about any programming language, native packages require compilation. They're written in C, and they require compilation, which means you need to have a compiler on your system somewhere. And if you're on a Mac and you see this error, it means you're installing Xcode, which is even more fun, because now you just want to write a blog post, you're trying to install a native gem, it's not working, and you're waiting for 1,000,000 gigabytes to come down just so you can write a blog post. And I know there's people out here, I know a lot of you are Windows people and .NET people, and that's totally fine. I won't hold it against you for a while, but you know what I'm talking about. Don't mess with me. You know what I'm talking about. If you tried to install Python, you don't have the right service packs on your machine, you get failures too, right? And I know a lot of people are thinking, well, just use .NET. Seriously, don't mess with me. I know what this feels like. And I put this up here because, well, I have to take digs at my coworkers, Damien Edwards and David Fowler, every single time just for .NET Core because I love them. And that's just what I do. Anyway, stuff like this is really, 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 really frustrating. Super frustrating. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just have a development environment work? So that problem said, this is what my talk is all about today, is we're going to install these remote extensions, remote containers, and then see how we can have Docker help us out. And again, I'm going to say the same sentence over and over in this talk, creating a local developer experience, which I think is neat. Okay, so what we need to do then is we're going to go over to remote containers. As you can see, there's the extension. Download it and install it if you want to play along, because you can download and run my blog on your machine in just a few minutes if you like. Of course, why not? Second, if you have Docker running, make sure to give it some resources, because what we're doing here is we are trying to create a development machine using Docker. In fact, a lot of development machines. This isn't just production use, because in production, you can get away with having a slimmed down version of whatever it is you're running. But for local development, you got to give it a lot of love. You got to give it a lot of juice, I should say, not goose. You can give it goose too if you want. Here I've got 5 CPUs running, I've got 12 gigs, ramp it up, give it everything you got. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to containerize my blog. And all I need is some Ruby. I don't need much in here. So the first thing I do, now that I have this extension installed, is I need to add some configuration files. So I go to the command palette, Command-Shift-P, and it brings up the command palette. It's on a Mac, Control-Shift-P on Windows. And the first thing I'm going to do is select add container configuration stuff. And I get to select my definitions now. The extension is smart enough that it will look at the local directory and see that I'm working in Ruby. It sees a gem file in there and a few other things and says, oh, hey, well, are you working on Ruby? Because it looks like you are. Maybe you are working on Rails and so on. Well, I'm going to pick Ruby. And now I get asked what version of Ruby I want. And this is where I actually failed for about an hour straight because I couldn't understand what was going on. I picked the wrong image. And do all of you work in Docker? I mean, are you familiar with Docker by these days? Yes, no? Okay, oh boy. So it turns out that Docker has a lot of different types of images when it comes to Linux. And I'm going to talk more about this later on. My problem was that I didn't choose the right one for Ruby, and it needed to be bullseye, and I had a big problem with that. I'm going to talk more about that later on. But for this, what I need to do is I need to choose 2.7 bullseye, because that's what Jekyll wants. And so I'm going to choose that here. And then the next question is, what version of Node do you want? Because we all need to use Node no matter what we're doing. And I'm going to choose none because I'm just using a static blog. And this next pane I really, 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 really like, because to me, it brings home the whole idea that you're building a developer box. right? We're building a development experience here. These are tools that we would use every single day in our development thing, like AWS, Azure CLI if you want to deploy to Azure. Homebrew is pretty neat. You have Gradle in there. Git, of course, is something I'm going to need, so I'll choose Git. And the next choice that I get after this is, there we go, what version I want. I want latest, and when we're done here, what I have next is a .dev container folder. And this is something I thought was pretty neat. Inside this folder, it's a special folder that VS Code recognizes as 2 Docker files that describe all my choices I just have, and then a devcontainer.json that orchestrates Docker. This tells VS Code how to run Docker for you. And I think this is pretty cool that it's all just file-based. There's nothing hidden away in the guts of VS Code, and someone at Microsoft decided to not freak out and make it proprietary, and I think that's kind of strange, but why not? Okay, so what does this Docker file look like? Or sorry, what does the developer devcontainer.json file look like? And this is it. It's pretty simple and straightforward. This is where your settings go that will help orchestrate Docker. There's all kinds of things you can do in here, naming the user, specifying what variant of Ruby you want, and so on. And that's it. So we have Ruby, Docker file. We know it's going to be 2.7 bullseye. Off we go. This is the Docker file itself. There is nothing in here that is terribly alarming, terribly different if you know Docker. If you don't know Docker, this will probably look freaky and strange, but these are just instructions for building containers from images off in the cloud somewhere. One thing I do want to call out is if you look at line 9 over there, you can see that Z shell is being installed. And if you're a Windows person and don't know anything from Z shell or whatever, Z shell is a special kind of shell that's basically for developers. And there's all kinds of extensions that go along with it, and it's wonderful. It's kind of a fun thing. But they install it by default. All right, well, what I like to do is I want to now just run things. I'm going to reopen this whole experience in a container, and I want to see what breaks, because that's what I do. And I want to start from the first effort. How far do I have to go before things work? That's just how my brain works. I'm not sure why. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hit the command palette again, remote containers, reopen in container, and VS Code is going to do its thing. There's a couple things I want you to notice. Look at my extensions. That's extensions on the side. They're gone. They're all gone. In fact, if you look at what I have now, I don't even have syntax highlighting. I have nothing. VS Code blanked out. It's looking for its settings, and it says, I don't have any settings, because it keeps its settings in the container. So VS Code itself is containerized in this sense, which is really fascinating. And this is where stuff starts to gel, where I'm not working locally. Everything's kind of in this container, which is pretty wild. Okay, notice too that I don't have any files, which is kind of scary. But I'll get to files soon enough. So what happens now is a bunch of images and a bunch of things come flying down. This takes about 2 to 3 minutes to run. It doesn't take all that long, but it takes long enough that it's a bit of a pain, especially if you're trying to give a demo and stand here on stage over conference Wi-Fi, which is why I'm doing the videos. Once that's all done, my files show up again inside of VS Code, and then you can see that I have a prompt inside the container using the terminal. And if I want to run my blog, I can just hit make and off I go. I don't blame you if you're a Docker person right now and you're saying, who cares? Like, why would I develop in Docker? What am I saving here? What is this getting me? Because someone just asked me earlier today, like, is this like working in Docker and WSL, or is it like, I don't understand? I'm like, just, you have to see it. You really do have to see it. At least I do. And if I do, that means you do too, because I'm sure you're just like me, right? Anyway, so let's move on. I want to show you that there's a lot of components here, but when you see it all working together, it's a lot of fun. All right, so I'm going to hit make here, because make is how I launch my blog. I just have my instructions in there. It's just easier for me to write 4 letters instead of a bunch of commands. And here we are. We get another error. And you might be thinking, well, what did you save here? Well, this makes me excited, because I am now at parity with my local experience. I don't have any gems. So all I got to do is get some gems in here. I got to get my gems in my container in order for it to work right. So there's 2 ways that I can do this and solve this problem that I have. The first way is to open up the devcontainer.json file here, and I can scroll on down, and I want you to notice how many comments are in there. These helpful little comments that kind of goose you along and help you out as you try and build things. And the first thing I see down here is a post create command. And this is the little hook that goes off when the container is created from the image for the very first time. Inside here, we tell it to run a command in the container, and it will, bundle install, which is kind of nice. The other thing I want you to notice, because I'm going to bring this up later on, is on line 25, it says forward ports. And that's important if we're using a database, and a database is in a container, but you might have some GUI tools on your local machine. You want to have those ports forwarded so those tools can talk to each other. And I'm going to come back to that. All right, so now that I've done that, what I have to do now is I have to reopen and rebuild, or rebuild and reopen everything, because I've changed the configuration now. And this is, again, why I'm doing videos, because this takes a while to have everything cycle down. And then it's also going to go up and grab the gems, which I'm going to fast forward over because this isn't very fast. And so once I've done that, my gems come down, and the container is sitting there and running and saying, wahoo, we should be good to go. So here I'm going to open up a shell, and it's going to hopefully pop up, and there we go, pop up in the command line. And then I'm going to hit make, and we're going to wait a second, and it's going to start generating. And this is why you need to have a lot of resources dedicated, because Jekyll takes a little bit of time, and I've got a lot of blog posts in there. And it took a little bit of time, and boom, up it goes. Here's my blog. That's that. Now, I'm not going to tell you that it's all easy peasy. And again, I'm going to get to this later on. There are a number of problems I had to face, and I'm going to walk you through each of those. But to me, when I saw this pop up, I was like, oh my gosh, hallelujah. I don't have to deal with Ruby and Jekyll anymore. And a lot of people might be saying, well, just use WordPress or Ghost or something. Why are you bothering? Like, I'll never use WordPress again. Oh my God. Jekyll is just the easiest thing to write your stuff in Markdown. There's another hook I can code here too. So for instance, if you cloned my blog down, you had the dev container running, you might not know to run make to start my blog. So what I could do is I could say, well, I'll just run that for you on post start. So after the container started, we're going to run make, and then my blog's going to come up, and you can play with it. You could use this for your own blog if you want. Once again, we changed evercontainer.json. We've got to rebuild and reopen. VS Code blanks out, and it opens up again inside the container. So you can see down here, the gems are getting installed again because we had to rebuild the container, so the container had to start up and create again. But now we have running post start command, and make is up, and my blog is up. So that's that. I want to show you the second option, because I said there was two options for getting those gems installed into the container. First is to use the hook. That's what the team recommends. And the second is to use Docker itself. If you're familiar with Docker, then this might make sense to you. It's a better option. It's up to you. When you do it inside of the Docker file here, you're actually making those gems part of the image. So it's dedicated to what you're trying to do, which is pretty neat. So to use Jekyll, I just need to install Jekyll itself, this gem called rexml, cram down rouge, and the parser for the command backticks. What I want to point out here is that I don't need to do any of this. I mean, if I had a Docker file that I had dedicated to Jekyll already, I could just use that. I could use anything. None of this is proprietary. None of this is specific to VS Code. They're just Docker files. And you can put in here whatever you want. So maybe at your shop you have a Docker file dedicated to your team. It doesn't really matter. VS Code will orchestrate it for you and just pop it up, which is pretty neat. Okay, I didn't know this before, that you can look at your extensions in VS Code, and each extension has a dedicated ID, which I didn't know. And you can grab that ID using a gear. Why do we care about this? Why do we care about extension IDs? Because this is going to take this experience one step further, which I think is pretty neat. We can copy this extension ID right here out of our extensions pane, and then we can go over to our devcontainer.json file, and right here we have an extension setting. And what I can do is I can just add that Markdown extension right there in the settings. When VS Code reopens now, it's going to have that extension as part of that Dockerized VS Code instance, which blew my mind the first time I saw it. Like, you've got to be kidding me. You might want to have some Jekyll support. Every time you use the blog, you might want to have Jekyll snippets. You might not want to have that in your local VS Code, but when you open up the blog, you probably do. So we can add that to the container as well. I just need to add the ID right here in the extensions. This is where things started to churn in my mind. Like, oh, a dedicated VS Code experience using a Docker container that runs the stuff I need. Wow, this is starting to get really interesting to me. All right. All of this is interesting and fun to play with, but the fun part comes if I want to share my blog with you, which, of course, why wouldn't you want my blog? It's fun. what I need to do now is I need to then run Git and add everything to Git. And the dev container stuff is supposed to be in Git because it's part of the site. Now my Git repository is file-based, so it got added to the container when the volume kicked up and the container kicked up, and it all went. So that's good because I have my repository there as part of my code. Right here, I just want to show once again that this is all file-based. And it's super, super easy to go in and solve problems and trying to figure out what's going on rather than twiddling a bunch of buttons and checkboxes. All right, now that I've done this, what I want to do next is I need to add everything and then write a really horrible commit message that just looks like absolute crap. I don't know what I was thinking when I was doing this. Who thinks that this is going to work if I push it up to GitHub? Does anybody think it's going to fail? Because what I like to do, that's right, that's what I like to do. I like to fail. Of course it's going to fail. It failed because I'm using an SSH key that doesn't exist. Because my container, or my container is running in Linux, and it doesn't know who I am. It doesn't know anything about me. So I don't have an SSH key in there. So how do I solve this problem? Because I want to get my blog up there. And there's a bunch of ways to go about this. The first is I could just pop out locally again into my terminal locally because it's a Docker volume, so everything that exists in the Docker container also exists locally on my machine, and I could just push it up. That's the easiest thing to do. But that's just hacky. Second thing I could do is something that Burke Holland recommended when I asked him about this, is just use HTTPS instead of SSH. And that means going to GitHub and getting a URL and then getting my credentials down and putting it into the URL and then making that my remote as opposed to SSH. If you're on a big team, that's a good way to go because everybody could have individual access tokens, and then it's easy to push up there and you know who did. So that's way number one. Way number two is you might have a shared key that you could share in a file dedicated to this thing, and you can share it among your team, and then you just push to that. There's so many answers to this. What I decided to do, because I needed to have a demo here and I needed to just kind of contrive one, is you can also mount something using the devcontainer.json. You can do this inside your Docker file too, but this just makes it easier. So inside of here, I can add what are called mounts, and then I add a string, and what I'm doing is I'm mounting my local directory, my local SSH directory, users Rob SSH, and I'm mounting it in the dev container where the SSH stuff should be. And it's a bind mount, so it'll stay in the container, but the files don't actually go over. They're just available to the container, but the key stays safely on my machine. So that's how I'm solving this problem. All my machines that I have me as Rob as a user, so it works for me. For a team, I don't think this is the best idea unless everybody in your team is named Rob, but you know, why not? Okay, so let's try this again. So git status, I'm checking this all out. So when we do git push, this would be a really bad demo if it didn't work, which I'm all into bad demos too, why not? But we're gonna push it up again, and this time it is gonna work, and up goes my blog. And the way, in case you don't know, to finish this off, Jekyll was created by Tom Preston Werner, who was the co-founder of GitHub a long time ago. And his idea was, why do we keep reinventing the wheel with these sites backed by databases and refreshing the thing with whatever? So he invented Jekyll. He also invented Gravatar. That guy's pretty active. Anyway, the point is that GitHub will natively cycle Jekyll blogs for you. All I've got to do is push Jekyll stuff up there. I don't have to pre-render it or anything. GitHub does the rest for me, and my blog goes live. If you want to play around, and this is going to be the fun part, if you want to play around and you want to clone my blog, here's the address. It's right here. If you pull it down, you'll have a dev container file in there. And if you have VS Code with a remote extension and a Docker running, VS Code will see that and say, do you want to reopen everything in a container? And then it's going to pull down all the images you need. It's going to install all the extensions that you just saw me put in there, and you'll be up and running, just like that, which I think this starts to get pretty interesting. Okay, here's hint number 2 about the cover of my slides. Anybody recognize this band yet? Okay, got 1, got 2. All right, hey, you guys are still awake. It's pretty good for 3:20. I also have to say it was 2 or 3 years ago that I finally figured out what never mind the bollocks means, and I was warned that that's not a good word. It's hysterical over in the US. I think it's a funny word, but over here, this could get me in trouble, so just pretend you didn't see that. The reason I'm showing you this is I wouldn't doubt if you're sitting out here saying, seriously, your blog, you're giving a demo of this VS Code thing in your blog, that's awesome. It's not a to-do list, because Microsoft guys like to-do lists. but I tried to do something a little more complicated. Anyway, let's move on to something a little more complicated. This is a starter kit that I made a little while back for people who were just trying to get up on Node and trying to figure out how to use Node in a real way. And so I call it Node PG Start because it's using Node, Postgres, Redis for session caching. It also has authentication built in using OAuth, Google, and GitHub. It has email baked in. It uses Tailwind CSS. I'm trying to do all these things because at the very end of the day, I'm hoping that you deploy it to Azure because I don't want to get fired. So that's the idea. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to clone this down. This is the starter kit. I'm going to clone this down. I'm going to go through the whole process again of putting this into a container set so that you can pull it down and play with it and work with it later on. Also, what I didn't show you is I also did npm install. As you can see, I've got Node modules in there. So I did npm install after I cloned it down. OK, so what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to add the configuration one more time. And here you can see I have Node. I have a choice, too, of Node and Mongo and Node and Postgres. And of course, I'm going to use Postgres because I'm not a Neanderthal. That's for my friend Luz. She works at Mongo. I told her I had to work her into the talk somehow. No, but I'm going to choose Node and Postgres because Node and Postgres is what I want to work in here. I'm using an Express application. And now I'm confronted with the same message again. What is this? And I remembered when I was putting this together, oh, right. Everything crashed when I was trying to make my blog work because I didn't have the right image of Ruby. And so I looked at this and I was like, oh man, I can't remember how to solve this. Because to solve it before, I had to email the team and like, oh, just use this. And they didn't tell me why. And I like to know why when things fail, because I like when things fail, but I like to know what happens when I fix them. So what I did was I went and Googled it. And it took me a while. It took me a while to find it. So for those of you who don't know, there is a reason why these images have these names. So this article is up on Medium. Google the title. It's a really long URL, so it doesn't make any sense. It's written by Julie Parilla Garcia, and she decided to dive in and figure out why are all these things named these like Alpine, Buster, Slim, and so on. I'll just summarize it for you real quickly, in case you don't know. Alpine is a dedicated Docker image of Linux, and what they did is they stripped out everything. The name of the game with Docker is to have the smallest images you can, and 99% of the time, you're going to have some flavor of Linux running whatever it is you want to do. So what they thought was, well, let's see how small we can make Alpine. They stripped out all the guts, and there you have Alpine. Or they wanted to see how small they could make Linux. So they, came up with Alpine. Stretch, Buster, and Jessie, those are flavors of Debian. Debian is a different distribution of Linux. So some people like Debian, some people like Ubuntu, whatever, it doesn't matter, whatever floats your boat. So Stretch, Buster, and Jessie is Debian 10, 9, and 8, again, stripped down. Then we get to Bullseye, which is the one that I need to use. And why do I need to use it? Because I'm running an M1 Mac that has an ARM chipset, and the other versions of Debian don't work. So I need Debian 11. There you go. So you're going to run into this problem if you run an ARM machine. You just want to make sure you find Bullseye. I think Alpine latest versions do run an ARM. I'm not sure, but I think. OK, well, now that I know that, I've chosen Node 16 Bullseye. And then in here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to choose Git, latest, right? And we've already seen this before, so kind of skipping ahead, here's what I have now, because I chose Node and Postgres. And so I get a dev container now with a Docker compose file and a Docker file. So I'm going to assume that not everyone here knows what Docker is and Docker Compose. You might have heard of it, but I'm just going to tell you that Docker Compose is a system that sits kind of on top of Docker, and it orchestrates containers together. It has networking in there, it has volumes and shared things, and basically you just have to do a YAML file, and then you can orchestrate all these containers together so they can play along nicely. Skipping ahead here, I just want to show you what that file looks like. Basically, it's divided into services. You have app. In my case, I have app and DB with some settings in there that tell those Docker files how to behave. So down below, you can see that I have an image that I'm pulling down, Postgres latest. Probably not a good idea. Usually good to have a targeted version number that you want, but I'm just going with latest. That's what I was given. And then in the environment, you can see I have a password, user, and a DB named Postgres. And a lot of people, Docker users especially, would probably be freaking out. But again, I want to highlight that this is for development. This is for local. This is not for production. Production concerns are completely different. This is just for you to run locally. Well, that's that. I mean, I should be up and running, right? And this is what I like to do. I like to break things. I like to have failure. I'm about to reopen this, but one thing I did want to show you really quickly, as it's doing its reopening thing, this takes about 5 minutes total to pull the images down and build. I wanted to come back to the Z shell thing. When you open up a terminal, you get a chance to open up a shell of your choice, whatever's available. So what's available in my Docker container are two different shells. There's Bash and there's Z shell. For Windows users, you probably don't care at all unless you're using WSL. And if you are, you're probably using Bash, I think, depending on whatever Linux flavor you have in there. But Z shell is pretty cool, man. Z shell is what developers like to use. I have Z shell on my machine, and I also have my Z shell, which is an extension to it. It's a really fun project. And the reason I'm showing you this is that if I'm in my workspace and I want to take a look around, I can just type L, and L is not an actual command. L is a shortcut that I have locally for ls-la, which means list out everything, show me all the hidden files, and so on. In fact, I can ask my container to show me all my aliases. This isn't supposed to be in there. But what happened is it pulled in all my settings locally into the terminal, which is pretty neat. So my Z shell is in there, and so VS Code looked at my Z shell settings and said, oh, well, let's put them in the container for him, which I thought was pretty cool. And that's not exactly a remote container thing. That's just VS Code's stuff kind of coming together nicely and making this experience even better. So the setting that you have that's always been in there is to inherit the environment from, in the terminal in VS Code, to inherit the environment of your local shell, which I think is rad. OK, so where are we? We're trying to make things fail. So I'm in the container again. It's up and running, and it's starting. And so what I wanted to run here is Npm Run Test. I wanted to see how far away am I from the goal line or from happiness to make this all work. And to be honest with you, this again filled me with joy. I know what this URL argument means, right? I need to connect to a database, and if I see a URL argument, I almost always know it means that there's a connection string problem. And sure enough, there must be, because I didn't set up any configuration. So to confirm this, let's pop over into my models directory, where all my models are. I'm using Sequelize, which is an ORM in Node. And I can see here that I have a database URL that's supposed to be on the environment, and it's supposed to be passed in so it can connect to the database. And it's not being passed in because I'd never configured it and never set it up. How do we set environment variables for these containers? Well, let's take a look. There's two ways to do it. There's probably more, but there's basically two. Again, the first thing you can do is you can go into devcontainer.json, and you can put a bunch of settings for Docker inside here. And one of them is you can set remote env, or remote env. What that means is it's going to set this environment variable for VS Code inside the containers, and every other container inside there is going to have this variable available to it. There's also another one called containerenv, which is isolated just to a container. But that doesn't work with what I'm doing because I'm using Docker Compose, and none of that really matters, but that's still there. Anyway, you just pop that right here, remote env, database URL. There it is. And that's what a database URL looks like if you're not familiar with it. Why would I do that instead of using Docker Compose? Well, this is one of the fun things you can do. Imagine your database isn't running in a container. Imagine it's maybe the dev database is on your network somewhere. You don't want to embed credentials for a remote system into a Docker container, into Git for that matter. You want to make sure that stuff stays safe. So maybe you want to keep it on your local machine in your environment. This is one way that you can pass in your local environment variables into a running container when it starts up. So here I could just pass it in directly. What I prefer to do is I prefer to use the environment setting inside of Docker Compose. That's just the environment key that you see here. And I can just tell it database URL and scroll down below, and you can see the password and the user and the database name and so on. I can use that to fill out the URL, which is pretty simple pimple. And again, I hope this isn't too shocking to you. This is just a way to connect to a database using a URL format. All right. So now I've changed Docker again, or changed the devcontainer.json file again, which means we need to rebuild and reopen. It's going to take a little while, but again, with the magic of video editing, I'm going to skip right ahead, and I'm going to open up Z shell one more time, and I'm going to print out the environment settings for my container. I want to verify that the database URL is in there, and it is, which is great. That means that my Node application should be able to pick it off the environment and be able to kick up the database. What do you think? Do you think it's going to work? I have to tell you, honestly, I was shocked. I was shocked that I got this to work. I really was. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. I did go through some problems here. I went through a few problems, but they were easy to figure out. It was like small problems. But when this ran, I couldn't believe it. And then I hit npm run dev, which is opening up the application locally. And here's what I get. My starter site. Postgres, Redis, and my extensions that I want. It's running Node. It's pretty neat. I know, Microsoft guy comes up here and his demo magically works, right? Isn't that fun? I'm not going to lie to you. Of course, we have problems. And I do want to step through those because there's two common problems that you have. And I also want to show you some debugging tools that are available to you with this extension when it comes to working with containers. All right, so let's take a look at some of the trouble. First problem I had was because I was being a dope, because I ran npm install when I cloned everything down. And when I did that, it pulled all the modules down, including one called argon2, which is a hashing algorithm that has won the hashing award, whatever that means. It's really good for protecting your users' passwords. Anyway, it's a native module, and it was compiled on my Mac. And that doesn't work if you're running in Linux, because it's different compilation stuff. I don't know, I'm not a Linux guy, that much of a nerd. But yeah, it didn't work. So I ran into this problem and I thought, what the heck? What? And I couldn't figure it out. And then I remembered, oh yeah, duh. I installed everything here. And the team and everybody recommend strongly that to install dependencies, you want to make sure you do it in the dev container JSON file. And we did that before in the post create command. So I went back, I added that in, post create command, npm install. So now when that pulls down any native stuff, it's going to be compiled in the container on Linux. The other one I ran into is a little bit more concerning, and I ran into this a lot. And it's when you go to start your container and something just utterly fails. It looks pretty catastrophic, too. You see this little white screen of death, and it's like, hey, we don't know what's going on. So you say, OK, open it up locally. Let's try and take a look and see if we can fix things. And good luck with that. Again, this is in preview, so the team's paying attention to the things that they can. And I know that one of the things they're trying to do is help debugging when dev containers doesn't work. And this is what it looks like when it doesn't work. And you can cruise through here and you can see that there's certain errors. Docker, right here you get an error, command failed, Docker compose something. And OK, whatever. Well, what I want to do right now is I want to show you how I solve this problem. Because I got this a lot, and it was really frustrating. The first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to see what containers were actually running. And what you can do, either in a container session or just locally, you can click on the remote containers extension icon in your extension list right there, and you can see the remote explorer. Inside of there, you can see I have Redis running, I have Postgres running, and I also have my workspace running. So this is taken when everything was running swell. If it crashes, you'll have two running containers and one won't work. Actually, I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to say two like that. Sorry. So right here, what you're seeing is me taking a look at my remote explorer with my containers running. And if I want to take a look at what's happening with Redis, I can. I can right-click that Redis image, and I can say, show me the logs. And up pops the logs from inside the container that are piped out to standard out. And what you get to see is the logs for the running version of Redis. I can also step into the container just by right-clicking, saying step into if I want to look around and see what's going on. Here's the same deal with Postgres. This is the log statement from, I believe, Postgres itself telling you what is running. And that is super helpful, especially if you're using an ORM like I am, SQLize, and you're not quite sure what's going on and you want to take a look at the query. This is how I solved my problem. Many problems, as a matter of fact. It's just Docker, right? And you can run Docker. You don't have to use VS Code to do it. So in my case, I couldn't figure out what the problem was. So I stepped into the dev container and I said Docker compose up, which is, since I'm using Docker compose, this is how you tell Docker compose to start running, if you don't know this. But basically, it's telling me here, your service Redis refers to an undefined volume. Oh, right. I copied and pasted way too fast when I was trying to put Redis in for some of the session stuff. And I forgot to add the volume down below. So once I fixed that, everything started to work a little bit better. Again, this is the site that I have. If you want to play along, you can go and grab it from Node or Rob Conery /Node PG start. It's up on GitHub. And you can pull it down, you'll have my dev container in there. And this is fun because now you can just start everything up. You've got Redis, you've got Postgres, you've got VS Code dedicated to this experience. You can start editing the code. You have to wait a little bit for everything to come down, but it's an isolated, targeted experience. In fact, to drive this idea home, I've also added a bunch of extensions in there that you're going to need for all the things that I have inside of this thing. So I have ESLint, because you're going to be working in JavaScript. I have the Azure Database extension, which is called Cosmos DB for some reason. I have a PG formatter for if you're going to write some SQL. Well, why not? I have EJS support because that's my view engine. I have Tailwind IntelliSense in there for you, so you can just start writing Tailwind code, because we all like to play with CSS, don't we? And then the IntelliSense is going to pop up. Documentation will be in there for you. I also have another database client, and you can see these database clients on the left side in the extension list there. And you just click on that, and as long as you forwarded your ports, because it even says right there under the extensions list, use forward ports if you want to talk to your database containers, you can connect these extensions to your container database and just start playing, start hacking along. There's nothing you need to set up. This starts to bring home some really interesting ideas. If you're running an open source project, for instance, or maybe you've got a team, you got a new developer coming on, they don't have to do a thing. They just need to pull your repo down. VS Code's going to say, hey, I see a dev container file in here, and then it's going to open it up for you. The Laravel framework is using this now as an option. My teammate, Alvaro Videla Godoy, that's a hard name to say at the end of a talk. He committed recently, or he added a PR to the team, and he said, hey, if you do -- dev container, here's what you can do. And so he made one, so every time you start a Laravel project, it'll pull down all the extensions that go along with PHP, because don't we all like to write PHP? And it'll pull down everything else that you want to use to work with Laravel, including MongoDB for sure, right? Am I right about that? Yeah. So anyway, it'll pop up and have all your project running and you're off and going, especially containers and so on. Well, I think I might have stopped a little early, but that's okay. It's the end of the day. I like to give back as much time as possible. If you have any questions, shout them out. I probably have, how much time do I have? I think I have about 5 minutes if anybody wants to ask any questions. Other than that, thank you for coming. I appreciate your time. Yes?